A listener who signs as Elena wrote to me from Venezuela a few days ago. She told me that what she is about to share happened to her when she was 35 years old, during a week she spent alone in her recently deceased grandmother's house, sorting through her things. She had never believed in any of this, until that week. If you have an experience with a family member who has passed away and somehow remained present, share it with me below. Now, this is what Elena found among her grandmother's belongings. My grandmother Petra died on a Tuesday in February. She was 83 years old and died as she had lived, on her own terms, in her own bed, without hospitals or machines prolonging something she had already decided to let go of. The last time I visited her, 2 weeks before her death, she took my hand with a strength that did not correspond to someone in that condition, and looked at me with those eyes of hers that always seemed to know something the rest of us did not. "Elena," she told me, "when I leave, go to the house before anyone else. Before your mother, before your uncles. You first." "Why?" I asked her. "Because there are things that are for you," she said, "and there are things that are for no one. You have to know how to distinguish which are which." I asked her what she meant. "You will understand when you arrive," she said, and she closed her eyes. Those were the last words she spoke directly to me. She died 9 days later, while sleeping, without pain according to those who were present. I am the eldest granddaughter. I was 35 years old then, working as an accountant in a medium-sized company, living alone in an apartment that was exactly the right size for a person who prefers order and silence. I was skeptical by nature, the kind that needs to see to believe, and that when she sees first looks for an explanation before accepting anything else. That was me before that week. My grandmother Petra's house was in an old neighborhood of the city, a house like those from before, with a tiled roof and thick walls, and an interior patio with a lemon tree that she tended to with almost ceremonial dedication. She had lived there alone for the last 12 years, since my grandfather died. The family visited her regularly, but no one lived with her because she did not allow it. I arrived 2 days after her death, just as she had asked me, before my mother and uncles who were organizing the arrangements from another city. I had had the keys for years. I entered alone. The smell of the house was the same as always. Lavender, coffee, old wood, something sweet that I had never been able to identify precisely, but that I completely associated with her. Everything was tidy as always because my grandmother Petra was a woman who did not leave things out of their place. The cups lined up in the kitchen, the books on their shelves, the pictures straight on the walls. There was only one thing different. In the center of the dining table, perfectly centered on the embroidered tablecloth that my grandmother used for special occasions, there was a notebook. It was old, with a black cardboard cover, worn corners, and a spine reinforced with yellowing tape from age. My grandmother had left it there on purpose, that was evident. She had placed it there for me to find. I sat in my usual chair, the one facing the patio window, and opened it. My grandmother's handwriting filled the pages from the first to the last. A handwriting I would recognize among thousands, round and precise, with that characteristic slant of people who learned to write when it was taught as a skill to be perfected. It wasn't exactly a diary. It was more like a record. Dates spanning decades, some entries very short with just a few lines, others occupying several pages. The tone was that of someone documenting, not of someone confessing. Concrete, without drama, like a report of things that happened and that deserved to be written down. I read for hours. What I found in that notebook was the story of a life I thought I knew, which turned out to be considerably more complex than any granddaughter could imagine. My grandmother Petra had had since she was young, a capacity that she described in the notebook with an almost technical neutrality. She could see things that others did not see, not exactly ghosts, at least not in the sense of human figures. She described them as presences, densities in space, accumulations of something that did not have a precise name, but that she had learned to recognize and distinguish from one another, like one learns to distinguish smells. He had spent most of his life learning to live with that, not to be frightened, to establish a functional distance between what he saw and what affected him. There were people in his life who knew about this ability and whom he turned to when he needed guidance. There were situations he had managed, things he had kept away from his family without anyone knowing, protections he had maintained active for decades. Some entries were about my mother when she was a child, about my uncles, about us, the grandchildren. There were several about me. The first era was when I was 6 years old. She described something she had noticed in me, an undeveloped ability, a potential she recognized because she had it herself. She wrote with a mix of satisfaction and concern that I understood perfectly. The satisfaction of recognizing something familiar, the concern of knowing what it implies. The entries about me continued over the years. Observations of things I did or said that went unnoticed by others, but that she noticed attentively. Moments when I had reacted to something without knowing exactly what. The time when, at 12 years old, I refused to go into the basement of a relative's house without being able to explain why. And she simply wrote in her notebook, "Elena felt it. She doesn't know what she felt, but she felt it. Good." I reached the last pages when it had already darkened outside and I had completely forgotten to turn on the lights in the house. I was reading with the natural light from the patio that filtered through the window, increasingly dim. The last entries were recent, from the last few months, written in a handwriting that seemed more strained, as if the hand struggled more than before, but the will to write was equally strong. The last entry was from 3 weeks before her death, 1 week before my last visit. It said, "There is something in the house that has been here for a long time and that I have kept still. It's not exactly bad, but it's not neutral either. It's something that remained from those who lived here before us, something that anchored itself to this place before I arrived. For decades, I learned to coexist with it and to ensure that it didn't expand outward. But I am leaving. And when I go, there will be no one to contain it anymore. Elena has what it takes to handle it, even though she doesn't know it yet. I am going to leave her instructions. She will know what to do." Underneath, there was a folded page, clipped to the inside of the back cover, that I hadn't seen until that moment. I peeled it off and opened it. There were instructions, written in the same precise handwriting, organized in numbered steps. What I was supposed to look for, what I was supposed to do with what I found. The words I was supposed to say, written phonetically with a note that said, "Don't ask where these words come from, just say the exact ones." At the end of the instructions, a brief note, "Don't be afraid. Fear is the only possible mistake. What is in this house will recognize you just as I recognized you. That is an advantage, not a danger. Use it." I sat in the darkness of the dining room for a time I did not measure. A part of me, the counting part, the skeptical part of 35 years with no experience that contradicted its worldview, wanted to fold that page, put the notebook in a box, and call my mother to tell her what I had found. Another part of me, an older and harder to name part, already knew I was going to follow the instructions. I started that very night. The first thing I had to do, according to my grandmother Petra's instructions, was to walk through each room of the house with the lights off and simply pay attention, not to look for anything, not to expect anything specific, just to pay attention. I walked through the house in the dark, the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, the guest room where I slept when I came to visit her, my grandmother's bedroom, which smelled more intensely of lavender and her than any other space, and where I paused a moment longer than expected, processing the absence. And then the room at the end of the hall, the one that had always been locked, the one I had never seen open in all the years I had been visiting that house. The one that, when I was a child, I asked my grandmother what was inside. She simply replied, "Things you don't need to see yet." The key was in the notebook, inside a small envelope glued to the first page that I had felt when I opened it but had not yet explored. I opened the room. Inside there was a small room, completely empty of furniture, with walls painted a white that had acquired a yellowish tone over the years. In the center of the floor, there was a circle drawn with something that looked like salt, perfectly intact. Inside the circle, a small object, a dark green stone, almost black, the size of my fist, with an irregular shape that did not correspond to any natural stone I knew. It had markings on the surface that could have been natural erosion or could have been deliberately engraved. The temperature in that room was noticeably lower than in the rest of the house. And there was something else, a presence, which is the only word I can use, although I know it is not precise, that I felt in a way that was none of the 5 conventional senses but was absolutely real. Like the awareness that there is someone in the room before you see them, only denser, older. I remembered what my grandmother had written. "He will recognize you." I stood at the threshold and let him recognize me. I don't know how long I was like that. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 20. At some point, the presence changed. It didn't disappear, but something in it settled, like when someone who was standing sits down, a relaxation of something that had been tense. I followed the instructions. What I did in that room during the next hour, I will recount only in general terms, not because I want to be mysterious, but because there are parts of my grandmother's instructions that she herself wrote that should not be repeated aloud or in writing. I took that seriously. The instructions involved the stone, the circle of salt, the words she had written phonetically, and an object that I had brought without knowing I would bring it, because the instructions said that I would have something of mine with me that would serve the purpose and that I would recognize what it was when the time came. I recognized what it was. It was a necklace that my grandmother had given me years ago, which I always wore without knowing exactly why, which I had never been able to leave at home even though sometimes it felt uncomfortable or out of place with certain clothes. Everything I'm going to say about what happened when I followed the last steps of the instructions is this. There was a moment when the temperature in the room dropped even further, to the point where I could see the steam from my own breath, and at that moment, the presence concentrated in a way that I can't describe except to say that it was as if all the space in the room compressed towards a point, and then it expanded, quickly, like an exhalation. And after that, the room was at the same temperature as the rest of the house, and the presence was no longer there. I sat on the floor in the middle of the broken salt circle, with the necklace in my hand, and stayed there for a long time doing nothing. When I went out, I picked up the stone with a cloth as the instructions indicated, without touching it directly, and took it to the yard. I dug a hole next to the lemon bush, which is where the instructions said I should bury it. My grandmother had written, "The lemon tree is the most honest tree in the garden. What is buried beneath it remains neutral." I buried the stone. I went back inside, washed my hands, turned on the lights, and made myself a coffee. That night I slept in the guest room and slept well, with that quiet depth that sleep has when the body has used energies it didn't know it had. The following days I spent organizing the house as I had promised, sorting out my grandmother's things for the family. My mother and my uncles arrived on the third day. None of them noticed anything different in the house. None asked about the room at the end of the hallway, which I had locked again. I didn't tell them anything. Not because I wanted to keep the secret indefinitely, but because at that moment I didn't have the words to tell it in a way that didn't sound like delirium, and because I had kept my grandmother's notebook in my bag and felt that it was mine before it belonged to anyone else. It still is. I have it at home, in a drawer that I don't open frequently, but that I know is there. I have reread certain parts many times. The entries about me, especially those that describe things she noticed in me that I never noticed in myself. And yet upon reading them, I recognize, like when someone describes a trait of yours that has always been there, but for which you never had a name. Has anything changed since that week? Yes, not dramatically. I don't wake up seeing apparitions or hearing voices, but there is something that works differently in me now. An awareness that I didn't have before or that I had without knowing how to use it. I enter a place and know things about it that I shouldn't know through any conventional means. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Most of the time, over time, it has seemed useful to me. My grandmother Petra knew what she was doing when she chose me. I have no doubt about that. And I have no doubts about the week in that house, about what I felt in that room, about the temperature that dropped and the presence that left, about the stone that is buried under the lemon tree in the yard of a house that now belongs to the family and that no one is going to unearth because no one knows it is there, except for me, and now, you. That is all Elena wanted to share. She told me it took her a long time to decide to send it, that she didn't know how it would sound written down. To me, it sounds exactly as it should, like something true. If a senior family member ever left you something, an object, a letter, a warning that you didn't fully understand at the time, I would love to read it in the comments. And if this story found you tonight while you were resting, consider subscribing to keep receiving more. Until the next story, take care. This story was sent to me by Raquel, an art restorer who worked in museums and private collections. What she discovered while restoring a 17th century colonial portrait made her abandon her career and burn all her work materials. If you have ever worked with ancient objects and felt that something of their past still remains in them, share it in the comments. Now this is Raquel's experience with a painting that should never have been restored. My name is Raquel, and for 12 years I worked as an art restorer specializing in Latin American colonial painting. It was a job I loved deeply. There was something magical about bringing back to life works of art that had been forgotten for centuries, revealing colors and details that no one had seen in generations. But that was before the portrait of Sor Inés, before understanding that some restoration work should never be done, before learning that there are things painted on canvas that are better left hidden under layers of varnish and dirt. It all started when the director of the Colonial Art Museum of Quito, Ecuador, contacted me about a special project. They had recently acquired a 17th century portrait of a nun, supposedly painted by one of the masters of the Quito school. The painting was in terrible condition, almost unrecognizable under centuries of grime, oxidized varnish, and moisture damage. "It's a unique opportunity, Raquel," the director told me via video call. "If you can successfully restore this, it would be an important discovery for the history of colonial art. And of course, the compensation would be generous." I accepted without thinking much. I had restored dozens of colonial paintings before. This work didn't seem different. The painting arrived at my workshop in Mexico City 2 weeks later, carefully packed in multiple layers of protection. When I finally unpacked it and placed it on my easel under the bright work lights, I was able to appreciate the magnitude of the challenge. The painting measured approximately 1 meter by 80 centimeters. It depicted a nun standing, dressed in the black and white habit of the Conceptionist nuns. Her hands were clasped in prayer, and her face was barely visible under the accumulated dirt. I could only make out the basic outline of her features. In the lower right corner, there was a barely legible inscription, "Sister Inés of the Most Holy Trinity, 1687. Nothing more. No artist's name, no further context. I began the restoration process as I always did. First, extensive photographic documentation of the current state. Then, analysis of the composition of the varnish and paint using ultraviolet light and X-ray shots. The X-rays revealed something interesting. There was another painting underneath, a pentimento as it's called in the art world. The artist had changed his mind about the original composition and painted over it. This was not unusual. Colonial artists often reused canvases or altered their works during the process, but there was something strange about this pentimento. The figure underneath seemed to be in a completely different position, almost as if it were screaming. I dismissed the observation. X-rays could be deceptive, showing shadows and shapes that were not really what they seemed. I began the cleaning. This was always the most delicate and rewarding process. Using specialized solvents and cotton swabs, I carefully removed layers of dirt and oxidized varnish, revealing the original colors underneath. The first sessions were normal. I worked in small sections, documenting each step. I first cleaned the background, revealing a beautifully painted convent interior with stone arches and a window showing a dark blue sky. Then I moved on to the nun's habit. The deep blacks emerged, rich and velvety. The whites were bright, almost luminous. The artist had clearly been a master in the handling of light and shadow, but it was when I started to clean the face that things began to get strange. The first sign that something was wrong was a smell. As I removed the layers of varnish from the face area, a sweet and sickly odor began to emanate from the canvas. It wasn't the typical smell of old paints or solvents. It was organic, almost like rotting flesh, but very faint. I thought that perhaps the canvas had developed mold at some point. I took samples for analysis, but the results came back negative. There was no active biological presence. The smell had no explanation. I continued working, although the smell made me uncomfortable. I carefully cleaned the nun's forehead, then her eyes, and when I finally revealed her full face, I had to stop. It was not a peaceful or pious face as you would expect from a portrait of a nun. The eyes were too wide open, the whites too visible, giving her an expression of terror or madness. The mouth was slightly open, as if she were about to scream. And there was something in the brushstroke, in the way the artist had captured every detail, that made the face seem almost alive. But the most disturbing were the eyes. They seemed to follow you. No matter from what angle you looked at the painting, Sister Inés was looking directly at you. It's an effect that some master painters achieved intentionally, but I had never seen one so pronounced, so unsettling. I took a break, needing to step away from the painting. I made tea and sat in my small resting area, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort. It was just a painting, I reminded myself. An inanimate object. The feeling of being watched was just my imagination working overtime. When I returned to the studio, the painting was different. Not physically different, not in any way I could document or prove. But the feeling in the room had changed. The air felt heavier, colder, and I swear that the expression on Sister Inez's face was slightly different, more aware. I told myself that I was being ridiculous. Too many hours staring at the same image can make your brain see things that aren't there. I continued with the restoration. During the following weeks, I worked on consolidating areas where the paint was peeling, repairing small tears in the canvas, and removing moisture stains. The work was technically successful. The painting was transforming, revealing the mastery of the original artist. But every day, the atmosphere in my workshop worsened. I began to have difficulty concentrating. I constantly felt that someone was watching me. I heard sounds when I was alone, barely audible whispers, footsteps upstairs even though I lived alone in a single-story building. And my dreams became disturbing. I dreamed of dark convents, cold stone cells, of women in black habits performing rituals that I could not fully understand, but knew were profane. In one of those dreams, Sister Inez spoke to me. She told me that there were hidden things in the painting, secrets that I had to uncover. She implored me to keep cleaning, to reveal everything that had been concealed. I woke up from that dream sweating, my heart racing. It was 3 a.m, and from my bedroom, I could hear something in my workshop, a whisper, constant and rhythmic, as if someone were praying. I forced myself to get up, to investigate. The workshop was empty, of course, but the painting of Sister Inez was faintly glowing under the emergency light, and I swear that her mouth, which had been slightly open, was now closed in a smile. The next day, I decided to investigate more about Sister Inez de la Santísima Trinidad. I contacted the museum in Quito, asking for any historical information they had about her. What they discovered in their archives chilled my blood. Sister Inez had been a Conceptionist nun at the Convent of the Immaculate Conception in Quito. She entered the convent in 1670, at the age of 16, a young woman from a wealthy family who had supposedly chosen religious life out of true vocation. But in 1687, the same year the portrait was painted, she was accused of heresy and witchcraft practices. According to the records of the Inquisition, Sister Inez had been leading secret rituals in the convent, invoking evil spirits, performing black masses. Several young nuns testified against her, describing nighttime ceremonies in which Sister Inez supposedly made pacts with the devil. She was tried, convicted, and executed, but here was the part that made me tremble. Before dying, Sister Inez swore that she would find a way to return. She promised that her spirit would remain in the world, waiting for the opportunity to complete the work she had begun. And the portrait had been commissioned just before her arrest. It was believed to have been destroyed along with all her personal belongings. How had it survived? And why would someone want to preserve the image of a condemned witch? I continued reading the documents. There was a final note, added years later by a priest who had investigated the case. It mentioned that the artist who painted the portrait, a man named Miguel de Santiago, had reported strange experiences during and after the painting sessions. He said that Sister Inez had asked him to incorporate specific symbols into the painting, hidden in such a way that only someone who knew what to look for could find them. The priest suspected that the portrait itself was part of some ritual, that Sister Inez had used the painting sessions to bind her essence to the work. He recommended that the painting be destroyed, but apparently his recommendation was never followed. I closed the documents with trembling hands. I was restoring something that should never have been preserved. A work of art that was also an artifact of black magic. A prison or an anchor for something dark. I should have stopped the restoration immediately. I should have returned the painting to the museum and let them decide what to do with it. But a part of me, the professional and curious part, needed to finish. I needed to see the complete painting, to reveal all the secrets it contained. That night, I worked late, driven by a compulsion I couldn't fully explain. I cleaned the last remaining areas. Sister Inez's hands, the crucifix she held, the final folds of her habit. And it was in those folds that I found them, the symbols, hidden in the shadows of the black habit, painted with a precision that was only visible under direct and intense light. There were symbols. They were not Christian. They were sigils of ceremonial magic, circles of invocation, demonic seals that I recognized from my art history studies on occult iconography. Every fold of the fabric contained one. There were dozens of them, a complex web of symbols that, when viewed all together, formed something larger, a complete ritual preserved in paint. And at the center of them all, hidden in the deepest fold of the habit, there was a word painted in letters so small that I needed a magnifying glass to read it. Liberation. The moment I cleared that final word, revealing it completely, something changed in my workshop. The temperature dropped drastically, my breath became visible, the lights flickered and dimmed, and the painting began to glow. It was not an illusion. A pale and sickly light emanated from the canvas, concentrated on the symbols it had revealed. It pulsed like a heartbeat, each pulse stronger than the last. I stepped back, tripping over my chair, falling to the floor. And then I heard it, a voice, the voice of Sister Ines, not in my head this time, but real, resonating in the workshop. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for freeing me." The air around the painting began to distort like heat rising from asphalt. And from that distortion, something emerged. A figure. Translucent at first, but becoming more solid with each passing second. It was Sister Ines, or what remained of her. She wore the same habit as in the portrait, but her skin was pale, almost gray. Her eyes were completely black, with no visible whites. And when she smiled, her teeth were sharp, too numerous for a normal human mouth. 335 years, she said, her voice raspy as if it hadn't been used in centuries. 335 years trapped in that canvas, aware but powerless. I knew that eventually someone would clean the symbols, revealing the complete ritual. I just needed patience. I was being dragged back, searching for my phone, something, anything. But Sister Ines moved with impossible speed, blocking my way to the door. "Don't be afraid," she said, although everything about her presence screamed that I should be afraid. "I won't harm you. On the contrary, I am grateful to you. You have completed the work I began over 3 centuries ago. You have given me physical form again." "What are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. "I am what I have always been, a seeker of forbidden knowledge, one who made pacts with powers that the church feared. They condemned me, executed me, but before I died, I found a way to preserve myself. I convinced the artist to create this portrait, to incorporate the symbols that would link my essence to the painting, but I needed all the symbols to be visible for the ritual to be completed. For centuries, they were hidden beneath layers of grime, until you came. I can cover them again," I said desperately. "I can reverse everything I did." Sister Ines laughed, a sound that had nothing of humor. "Too late. The seal is broken. The ritual is complete. I am free." She approached a window, looking out at the city of Mexico that stretched beyond. A new world, so different from the one I left. So many souls, so many opportunities. The work I started in that convent can continue now, expand beyond what I ever imagined. "What work?" I asked, although part of me didn't want to know. "Opening doors, breaking down the veil between worlds, bringing through those doors those with whom I made pacts. They gave me power then, and in return, I promised to prepare a path for them to this world. That promise is still in effect." I stood up with trembling legs. "I can't let you do that." Sister Ines turned to me, her expression almost one of pity. "You have no choice, but I will make you an offer. Join me. You have talent, a sensitivity to the occult that you don't even fully recognize. I could teach you, as I tried to teach the nuns in my time. We could do great things together." "Never. Then I will simply leave you with your life, for the gratitude I feel towards you. But do not try to stop me or warn others. It won't work, and if you try..." Their form momentarily became darker, more threatening. "Remember that I know where you live, where you work, whom you love. The freedom you gave me comes with responsibilities." And with that, they vanished. They did not walk towards the door, nor did they gradually disappear. They simply ceased to be there, as if they had never existed except for the persistent cold in the air and the painting that still faintly glowed on my easel. I was left alone in my studio, trembling, crying, trying to process what had just happened. I had unleashed something ancient and malevolent, and I didn't know what to do about it. I called the museum in Quito. I told them there was an accident during the restoration, that the painting was irreparably damaged. I lied, saying that a fire in my studio had completely destroyed it. Then I burned the canvas. I took it to my small backyard and set it on fire. The flames were of strange colors, greens and blues, and the smoke that rose had that same sickly sweet quality I had smelled during the restoration. As it burned, I heard screams. Not human screams, but something deeper, older. But I didn't stop. I let it burn completely until only ashes remained. I don't know if that made any difference. Sister Inez was already free. Burning the painting probably didn't return her to her prison. But at least I destroyed the portal, the anchor that connected her to that physical object. I gave up on the restoration. I couldn't continue, not after understanding that some ancient objects are not simply art or historical artifacts. They are prisons. They are traps. They are seals that keep contained things that should not be released. During the following months, I obsessively searched for news of strange events, rituals, anything that could indicate that Sister Inez was fulfilling her promise. I found some disturbing things: an increase in cult activity in Mexico City, reports of rituals in abandoned places, some unexplained disappearances, but nothing conclusive. Nothing that could definitively lead the authorities without making me seem crazy. And then, 3 months ago, I received a package. It had no sender. Inside was an old photograph taken in the 19th century according to the style. It showed a group of women dressed in black, standing in front of a building I recognized as my workshop. All the women had blurry faces except for one in the center. Sister Inez, clear as day, looking directly at the camera, or rather, directly at me through time. On the back of the photograph, written in ink that seemed very fresh, there was a message: "I'm always close, watching, waiting. If you change your mind about my offer, you just have to call me." I have not received direct communication since, but I know she is out there, working on her plans, fulfilling her promises to the entities with whom she made pacts over 3 centuries ago. And I live with the guilt of knowing that I set her free, that my professional ambition, my curiosity, my pride and my skill as a restorer were the tools I used to escape from my prison. Sometimes I wonder if I should have accepted her offer. If being part of whatever she is building, I could at least maintain some control over it, mitigate the damage it might cause. But then I remember those completely black eyes, those sharp teeth, the darkness that emanated from her like a palpable aura. And I know that whatever she is building is not something I should be involved in, no matter the consequences of refusing. So I live my new life. I teach art at a high school. Simple, safe, far from colonial paintings and secrets hidden beneath layers of varnish. But every night before sleeping, I check the news, looking for signs, waiting for the day when the doors that Sister Inez promised to open finally swing wide. And when that day comes, I don't know what I will do. Whether to flee further away, to try to fight, or simply to accept that this is the world I helped create when I cleaned that last symbol and completed the ritual I had waited 335 years to finish. The painting no longer exists, but Sister Inez does. And somewhere in this city, somewhere in this world, she is working, waiting, building, and I am the only one who knows the whole truth. The only one who could warn the world if anyone would believe me. But who would believe a story about a 17th century nun who used a portrait as a prison and anchor for her soul? Who would take seriously the warnings of a restorer who claims to have accidentally released a witch condemned by the Inquisition? No one. And Sister Inez knows it. It's part of why she let me live. Because my silence, my forced disbelief, is more useful to her than my death. So here I am, living with this knowledge, this guilt, this waiting, and wondering every day if today will be the day I finally see the full consequences of what I did when I revealed that last symbol and uttered that word painted centuries ago: liberation. And that's all Raquel wanted to share. She told me that writing this was almost like a confession, an attempt to warn others who work with ancient objects about the dangers that may lie beneath the surface. If you have ever worked restoring ancient art or historical artifacts and felt that something more than paint and varnish was present, let me know in the comments. Sometimes what we preserve from the past includes things that should have remained forgotten. May you rest peacefully tonight. A few days ago, I received a message from a listener who signs as Daniel from Guatemala. He wrote to me that what he is going to tell happened to him when he was 47 years old. During a week he spent alone in a cabin in the mountains. He told me that he never believed in anything supernatural until that week, and that now he can no longer say the same. If you have something similar saved, you know where to leave it. This is what Daniel experienced the night something knocked on his door. I am an emergency doctor. 12 years working in emergencies teach you to distinguish what matters from what doesn't, to make quick decisions with incomplete information, and above all, not to let panic take over when everything seems to indicate that panic would be the reasonable response. What I learned at work has saved me many times in everyday life, but there are things for which that training is of no use. It all started because I needed to rest. 12 years in the emergency room leave a fatigue that cannot be cured with a long weekend. It is a fatigue that accumulates in layers, like sediment, until one day you look in the mirror and see someone who functions properly, but has been functioning for a long time without really being there. My boss suggested I take a week off. My body had been asking me for the same thing for months. A colleague lent me his cabin in the mountains of Guatemala. A small, cozy construction, at almost 2,000 meters high, surrounded by pines and with no close neighbors. No cell signal, with Wi-Fi only via satellite that worked intermittently. The idea was to completely disconnect. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon. The cabin was exactly what I needed. A small living room with a fireplace, a functional kitchen, a bedroom with a bed that had a thick mattress and wool blankets. Outside, the pine forest that smelled of resin and cold earth, and the silence that the mountains have when one arrives from the city and has not yet learned to listen to it as silence and hears it as absence. I settled in, lit the fireplace, warmed up some broth I had brought in a thermos, and fell asleep before 9 at night. The first 2 days were filled with sleep and stillness. I got up late, walked around the cabin, read, ate leisurely, and went to bed early. My body gradually released that accumulated tension, like when one loosens a knot that has been very tight, and the fingers realize they were exerting force without noticing. It was on the third day that I noticed the boy. I was walking along the path that surrounded the cabin, about 200 meters from the building, when I saw him among the trees. He was a small figure, about the height of an 8 or 10-year-old child, standing between two pines about 30 meters from where I was. He was wearing dark clothing that was not suitable for the weather, without a coat despite the cold, and he was looking at me. I stopped. I waved my hand in greeting. The figure did not respond. He remained motionless, looking at me. I walked a few steps in his direction. When I reached the spot where he had been, there was no one. Just the pines and the ground covered with needles and the silence of the forest. I searched with my eyes in all directions. There was no child. There was no figure. I returned to the cabin, not quite understanding what I had seen. The eye deceives in the forest. Shadows create shapes. The contrast between the light filtering through the trees and the shaded areas produces illusions that the brain interprets as presences. I had an explanation and I applied it to myself. That night, while reading by the fireplace, I heard knocks at the door. They were not urgent knocks or from someone needing help. They were 3 slow, spaced knocks, with the deliberate cadence of someone who knows you are going to hear them and is in no hurry. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. I stayed still for a moment, listening. There were no more knocks. I got up, took the flashlight, and opened the door. The porch of the cabin was empty, the dark forest beyond the light spilling out from the open door. The cold of the night rushed in, with that smell of pine and dampness that the mountain forest has after the sun goes down. There was no one. I checked the perimeter of the cabin with the flashlight. Nothing. I closed the door and returned to the chair by the fireplace. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day I went down to the nearest town, which was a 40-minute walk away, to buy some things I needed. The town was small, with a store that also served as a hardware store and an informal information point for everything happening in the area. The man who ran the store was named Don Aurelio. He was older, with that build of someone who has spent their whole life at high altitude, and had the calmness of someone who doesn't need to fill silences with words. While I was paying for what I had bought, I mentioned almost in passing that I had seen a boy in the woods near the cabin. Don Aurelio stopped counting the change. He looked at me. "What was the boy like?" he asked. I described what I had seen, his height, the dark clothing, the way he stood still looking at me. Don Aurelio finished counting the change and placed it on the counter. "And did he knock on your door?" he said. I stood still. "How do you know that?" "Because he always knocks," said Don Aurelio. "It's what he does." "Who is he?" Don Aurelio leaned on the counter with his arms crossed and looked at me with the patience of someone who has had this conversation before and knows that the person on the other side is not going to fully understand but deserves to know. "Here they call him the boy of the forest," he said. "He has been here longer than any of us who live now. The old folks from when I was young already knew him, and so did their parents. No one knows exactly what he is. Some say he is the spirit of a child who died in the forest long ago. Others say he was never a child, that he only takes that form because it is the one that works best to get close." "Get close for what?" Don Aurelio looked at me directly. "To enter," he said. "Enter the cabin?" "Wherever you are," he said. "The cabin, the house, whatever. But first he knocks. He always knocks." "And what if someone opens the door?" Don Aurelio uncrossed his arms. "No one who has fully opened the door has been able to explain to me well what happened next," he said. "There are 2 or 3 people in the village who say they did it, and none of them talk much about it. What I do notice is that since they did it, they are different people from what they were before." "Different how?" "More subdued," he said. "As if something in them had gone away and not come back." I returned to the cabin with that conversation in my head and with a discomfort that I tried to analyze with the objectivity of the doctor I am. What Don Aurelio described was local folklore, the kind of story that small towns build around experiences that cannot be explained any other way. The child I had seen in the forest could be anything: the shadows between the trees, the fatigue, the mind that has been under pressure for months and that, in rest, begins to process everything accumulated in ways that seem external but are internal. I convinced myself reasonably well. Until that night. The knocks came at 11:40. 3 knocks. The same cadence as the night before. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. This time I did not get up immediately. I stayed sitting on the bed in the dark, listening. There was silence, and then a voice. It was the voice of a child, high-pitched, clear, completely inappropriate for the time and place. It came from the other side of the door, from the porch. "Sir," said the voice. "Sir, I am cold." I remained absolutely still. The voice had something that did not correspond to what it was saying. The words were simple. The request was that of any child lost in the cold. But the tone was flat, lacking the urgency that a child who is truly cold and afraid in the woods at night would have. It was the tone of someone reciting a learned phrase who knows what the right words are but does not exactly know how they feel. "Sir," the voice repeated. "Let me in." I did not respond. The silence that followed was long. Then I heard footsteps on the porch, slow, circling the cabin along the outside wall. I kept tracking the sound. The front porch, the right side wall, the back wall, the left side wall, the front porch again. It stopped in front of the door again. "Sir," said the voice, "I know you are awake." It was right, obviously, but the fact that he said it, that he chose to say it, gave me a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I got out of bed carefully, without turning on any lights. I walked to the side window, the one that faced the side of the cabin, and barely moved the curtain. Outside, in the darkness illuminated only by the moon, there was a figure standing next to the wall. It was the silhouette of a child. He was facing the wall, with his palms pressed against the wood, and his head turned in my direction. He was looking at me even though I had barely moved the curtain. I stepped away from the window. I sat in the center of the bed, with the flashlight on, and thought about what Don Aurelio had told me, about the people who had opened the door, about how they were now. The voice did not return that night, the footsteps neither. But at 3 in the morning, when I had already decided that I was not going to sleep anymore and was sitting by the fireplace with the fire turned up to the maximum, I heard something different. No knocks, no voice, just a breath. It was coming from under the door, the kind of sound made by a person lying on the floor with their face against the threshold. A slow and regular breath, too regular, without the variations that the breath of something alive has. I stayed looking at the crack under the door. Under that crack, very faintly, there was a shadow that moved slightly, as if something was there, on the other side, just inches from the wood. I didn't move. The breathing continued for what I estimated to be 20 minutes, although it could have been more. Then it stopped. The shadow under the crack disappeared. The forest fell into complete silence. At dawn, before it finished getting light, I packed my things, closed the cabin, and set off for the village. I didn't stay for breakfast. I didn't take inventory of what was left to leave it organized as I had promised my colleague. I simply left. I passed by Don Aurelio's store. He saw me enter with my backpack and my face of not having slept and didn't say anything right away. He served me a coffee without me asking for it. "How many nights?" he asked. "2," I said. He nodded. "Did she open the door?" "No." Something in his expression relaxed slightly. "Good," he said. "When she doesn't open the door, she loses interest after a while. She looks for someone who will. And is there always someone who does?" Don Aurelio looked at me over his coffee cup. "Always," he said. "There are people who are curious, people who don't believe, people who think they can handle it. There's always someone." I took the coffee, thanked him, and continued on to the city. I got home that same day. I took a shower, ate something, and slept for 12 straight hours. That night I didn't dream of anything. But at 11:40 exactly, I woke up. Not because of any sound, not because someone knocked on my door. I woke up alone, in the silence of my apartment in the city, with my heart racing for no apparent reason. I stayed still listening. My apartment was silent. The street outside had the normal noise of the city at night. There was nothing. I closed my eyes, and on the edge of sleep, very softly, almost inaudible, I heard 3 knocks. Knock. Pause. Knock. Pause. Knock. Coming from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. I didn't open any door, but since that night, every time it's 11:40 I wake up, and I stay still in the dark until it passes. I don't know how much longer it's going to keep happening. That's all I can say. And there ends Daniel's testimony. He wrote to me at the end that he still sleeps with the hallway light on, something he hadn't done since he was a child. I don't judge him at all. If you've ever heard something at night that you shouldn't have heard, or if you visited a place where the local warnings turned out to make more sense than they seemed, tell me in the comments. I'm interested in reading it. And if this story accompanied you tonight, subscribe to keep receiving more every week. Take care. We'll hear from you in the next story. I received this message 3 weeks ago from a follower named Isabel, and I read it twice before deciding that I had to narrate it. Isabel is 41 years old, lives in Chile, and what she told me happened when she was a child, at her grandmother's house in the countryside. She says that for decades she tried to convince herself that it was a dream, that childhood memory exaggerates and distorts. But there is a detail at the end of her story that does not allow her to keep believing that. If you also have a childhood memory that you could never explain, tell me in the comments. There is something about the fears we had as kids that stays etched in a different way. Now listen calmly. This is Isabel's story. I am 41 years old and I still can't look at a covered mirror without feeling my stomach drop to the floor. That is the first thing I want you to understand. I am not someone who gets easily scared. I have been working as a nurse for 15 years. And I have seen things in hospitals that most people would find hard to process. I am practical, straightforward, used to handling difficult situations without losing my head. But there is one thing, just one, that completely takes away that serenity from me. And it comes from when I was 9 years old, at my grandmother Clotilda's house, in the countryside south of Chile. I will tell it from the beginning because if the context is not understood, the important part does not have the weight it deserves. My grandmother Clotilde was my mother's mother, and she lived alone in a large wooden house about 40 kilometers from the nearest city. It was an old house, one of those built to last, with thick walls and small windows and a long corridor that led to the backyard where there was a vegetable garden and a chicken coop. My grandmother was 70 years old when I was 9, and she was a serious, quiet woman, with few words but much weight in each of them. She was not affectionate in the conventional sense. She didn't give hugs or say I love you, but there was something in her presence that felt like protection, like something solid to lean on. That summer my parents had to travel for work and left me for 3 weeks with my grandmother Clotilde. I didn't complain. I liked that house. I liked the countryside. I liked the freedom to explore the garden and the surroundings without the restrictions of the city. What I didn't like from the first time I visited when I was very small was the room at the back. The house had 5 rooms. My grandmother's, two for guests, one that she used as a storage room, and the room at the back, which was at the end of the hallway, with the door always closed. I had never seen that door open. I'd never seen my grandmother enter or leave there. When I was younger, I once asked her what was in that room, and my grandmother answered without hesitation, "Things that don't concern you." And that was it. In my grandmother Clotilde's language, that was equivalent to a lock and a warning written in red letters. That summer when I was 9, I was more curious than prudent. The first days passed with the pleasant normality of the countryside. I would wake up early, have breakfast with my grandmother in silence because she didn't talk much before 10 in the morning, go out to the garden, explore, come back for lunch, take a nap that I never wanted to take but that my grandmother insisted on. And in the afternoons I would sit on the porch to read or look at the sky, which in southern Chile has a color and depth that doesn't exist anywhere else. It was on the third day that I noticed something about the back room. I was taking the mandatory nap, or rather pretending to take it, staring at the ceiling of the guest room where I had been set up, when I heard a sound coming from the hallway. It was a soft, rhythmic sound, like something brushing against the wooden floor. It wasn't exactly footsteps. It was more like the sound someone would make if they dragged their feet very slowly, without lifting them. I stayed still, listening. The sound moved down the hallway from one end to the other, and then it stopped. Then it started again. 3 times in total, always the same route, always ending at the same point, which, I calculated without getting out of bed, was right in front of the door to the back room. When I stepped into the hallway, there was no one there. My grandmother was in the kitchen. I could hear it by the sound of the dishes. The hallway was empty and silent under the afternoon light. I didn't say anything to my grandmother. In the following days, I heard the sound again at other times. Always during the nap, always that same slow brushing against the wood. One afternoon, I gathered my courage and stepped out into the hallway just when the sound was active, wanting to catch it in the act. The hallway was empty, but the sound continued for a few more seconds, now clearly in front of the door of the back room, although I could see no source. As if something without a visible form continued to move through that space. Then it stopped, and in the silence that followed, from behind the closed door, I heard a knock, just one, soft but perfectly audible, as if someone had pressed the palm of their hand against the wood from the other side. I ran to the kitchen. My grandmother looked at me when I entered, and something in her expression indicated to me that it was not surprise that I saw in her. It was something more like recognition, as if she knew exactly where I had been running from and why. "Did you see anything?" she asked me directly. "I heard," I said, "in the hallway, a sound." My grandmother nodded once, very slowly. "Sit down," she said. I sat at the kitchen table. My grandmother dried her hands on her apron and sat across from me. She looked at me for a moment before speaking, with that way of hers of weighing the words before letting them go. "What you heard won't hurt you," she said, "but you have to listen to me carefully. There's a rule in this house that you have to follow without asking why. Can you do that?" I told her yes. "The back door doesn't open. Never, for any reason, especially at night. Do you understand?" "What's inside?" I asked, because I couldn't help it. My grandmother looked at me. "A mirror," she said. I waited for her to say something more. She didn't. "Just a mirror?" "A covered mirror," she said. "Covered with a black cloth, and it has to stay that way. As long as it's covered, what's inside stays inside. Do you understand me?" I didn't understand, but I nodded. "If ever, for any reason, you find that cloth fallen, you leave the house and call me. You don't stand there looking. You don't get close. You leave and call me. Is that clear?" "Yes, Grandma." My grandmother looked at me for a moment longer, as if checking that I really understood, and then she got up and returned to her things as if the conversation had been perfectly normal. That night I didn't sleep well. I was left thinking in front of the mirror about why a covered mirror in a closed room could be something that required rules and warnings. I had seen covered mirrors in other houses, always with practical or superstitious explanations that hadn't seemed unsettling to me, but something in my grandmother Clotilde's tone, something in the way she chose each word, told me that this was different. The next day in the morning, while my grandmother was in the garden, I approached the back room. I stopped in front of the door. It was a dark wooden door, old, with no visible particularity. The handle was made of iron, the old-fashioned kind, cold to the touch when I brushed it with my fingers. I put my ear against the wood. Silence. But a silence that felt full, like the silence of a room where someone is holding their breath. I stepped back. 4 more days passed without news. The sound in the hallway did not return. The house was quiet. My days had their pleasant routine, and I began to convince myself that I had scared myself unnecessarily, that the sound had some logical explanation, that the conversation with my grandmother had been exaggerated by my childlike imagination. Then, the night of the storm arrived. It was a Thursday. The sky closed in the afternoon, and by 8 at night it was raining with an intensity I had never seen in that area, with thunder shaking the windows and lightning illuminating the field in white flashes. My grandmother closed all the shutters, prepared hot chocolate, and we spent a while in the kitchen listening to the storm from inside. At 9:30 she sent me to bed. I didn't want to go, but with my grandmother Clotilde, arguments didn't exist. I went to the guest room, got under the covers, and listened to the rain hitting the wooden roof with a sound that usually felt comforting, but that night had something different, something more urgent, heavier. I fell asleep unknowingly at some point between the thunder, and I woke up to the sound, not the sound of the hallway of naps. Another sound, different, that came from outside the house and that at first I confused with the wind. It was like a whistle, but with a rhythm too regular to be wind. It rose and fell with a rhythm that resembled a melody too much without being one entirely. I sat on the bed. The clock on the nightstand read 2:20 in the morning. The storm had eased. It was still raining, but no longer with the fury of before. The whistling continued outside, moving slowly around the house. I heard it pass by my bedroom window, follow along the side of the building, round the corner, and continue toward the back hallway. I got up without thinking, with that strange logic the brain has at 2 in the morning when it is not fully awake. I stepped out into the hallway silently. It was dark. The only light came from the distant lightning that entered through the slits of the shutters in irregular flashes, and then I saw the back door. It was open. Not completely open. Just an inch, maybe 2, but open. A rectangle of denser darkness in the darkness of the hallway. I froze. I remembered what my grandmother had told me. Get out of the house and call me. Don't just stand there. But I didn't move. From inside the room came a very faint glow, almost imperceptible, of a color I couldn't quite describe. It wasn't white or blue or green. It was something between those colors, something that had no name in my 9-year-old vocabulary and doesn't now. A soft, pulsing glow, as if something inside that room was breathing. And within the glow, behind the ajar door, I saw a shadow. It wasn't the shadow of an object or a piece of furniture. It was the shadow of a figure. Tall, thin, perfectly still, standing in the center of the room. No distinguishable features, just a dark shape outlined against the strange glow. The figure didn't move. Neither did I. I don't know how long we were like that. The figure motionless in the room and I motionless in the hallway. It could have been seconds, or it could have been several minutes. Time had a different texture at that moment, stretched and dense. Then the figure raised a hand. Slowly, without abruptness, without apparent threat. It just raised what would have been the right hand if it had been a person, and pointed at something. Not at me. Toward the side of the room where, according to what my grandmother had explained to me, the mirror should be. And it was at that moment that I heard my grandmother Clotilde's voice. Isabel. It came from the end of the hallway, from her room. A single word spoken softly, but with an intensity that activated something physical in me, an impulse that had nothing to do with conscious thought. I turned and ran toward her room. My grandmother was standing in the doorway of her room, in a nightgown with a lit candle in her hand. She grabbed my arm when I reached her and pulled me into her room. She closed the door. She stood with her back to it for a moment, eyes closed and lips moving in something that made no sound. Then she opened her eyes and looked at me. "Did you see her?" she asked. I nodded. "Did you look in the mirror?" "No," I said. I looked at the figure, but not at the mirror. My grandmother closed her eyes again briefly, and on her face was something that at that moment I interpreted as relief, but that now, at 41 years old and with the perspective of what came after, I recognize as something more complex, like relief mixed with the certainty that the problem wasn't over, just postponed. Good, she said. That's what's important. What would have happened if I had looked in the mirror? My grandmother was silent for a moment. What is in that mirror has been wanting to come out for a long time, she finally said. To come out of the mirror and out of the room. The black cloth holds it back. If someone looks at it when the cloth is down, it gives permission. Permission for what? To follow you, she simply said. That night I slept in my grandmother Clotilde's room, on a cot she took out of the closet with an efficiency that indicated to me it was not the first time she had used it for this purpose. We didn't talk about the subject anymore. My grandmother blew out the candle and we remained silent in the darkness with the rain that had intensified again outside. Before I fell asleep, I asked one last thing. Who opened the door? My grandmother took a while to respond. Sometimes what is inside finds a way to move things, she said. That's why the fabric has to be well placed. I'll check it tomorrow. I didn't say anything else. The next morning, under the clear and washed light left by the heavy rain, my grandmother Clotilde entered the back room. I stayed in the hallway without peeking, without trying to see anything. I heard her moving around inside for a few minutes. Then she came out, closed the door, and made sure it was properly closed by running her fingers along the frame as if sealing something. Was the fabric down? I asked. Halfway, she said. It's fixed now, and she didn't talk about it for the rest of my stay. I went back to my parents' house 2 weeks later without having mentioned it to anyone. I didn't tell my mother. I didn't tell my friends. I kept it the way children keep things they don't have words to explain, in a place inside where it didn't bother too much but where it also didn't disappear. My grandmother Clotilde died when I was 18. I went to the funeral. I was at the house for the last time during the days of the wake, and at some point during that visit, unexpectedly, I found myself alone in the hallway in front of the door to the back room. The door remained closed. I put my hand on the doorknob but didn't turn it. I stayed like that, with my hand on the cold metal, thinking about my 9-year-old grandmother, about the strange glow, about the figure that pointed at the mirror, thinking about everything my grandmother Clotilde knew about that room and that she had taken with her without fully explaining. A cousin of mine who was in charge of organizing the sale of the house found me there. What's in that room? I asked him. My cousin shrugged. I don't know. It's locked and we didn't find the key among Grandma's things. Probably just old junk. Are you going to open it? Eventually, I suppose. To empty the house before selling it. I told him to be careful. He asked me why and I didn't know how to explain it. I told him that Grandma was superstitious about that room and left it at that. The house was sold that same year. I never knew if my cousin opened the room before handing it over. I never asked him. There are questions whose answers I don't want to have. But this is what I was going to tell you at the beginning. The detail that doesn't let me keep believing it was a dream or a child's imagination. 5 years after the death of my grandmother Clotilde, when I was 23, I was in the apartment I shared with 2 university roommates. A normal apartment in a normal building, with no history, nothing peculiar. One of my classmates was named Fernanda. One Friday night, Fernanda arrived with a mirror she had found at an antique fair, large, with a dark carved wooden frame, the kind one imagines in an old and stately house. She had paid almost nothing for it, she said, because the seller wanted to get rid of it quickly. She placed it in the hallway. I looked at it, and I recognized it. I have no way to prove this. I know it sounds impossible, that mirrors are objects without memory, that southern Chile and that university apartment are completely separate worlds. But I recognized it with a certainty that did not come from any reasoning but from something much more visceral. The dark wooden frame with the specific carving in the corners, the exact proportions, the glass with a slight tint that was not entirely transparent. It was the same mirror. It took all the self-control I had not to run out of the apartment. I told Fernanda that the mirror couldn't stay in the hallway, that she should put it in her room or somewhere else. Fernanda asked me why, and I didn't know what to tell her. I made up something about how mirrors in hallways at night made me uncomfortable, that I was scared to see myself when I wasn't expecting it. Fernanda laughed, but she moved it to her room. That night, from Fernanda's room I heard the sound, the same soft brushing on the floor, the same slow rhythm I had heard 12 years earlier in the hallway of my grandmother Clotilde's house. The next morning, before Fernanda woke up, I took the mirror from her room, wrapped it in the thickest sheet I could find, and took it out of the apartment. I put it in the street's garbage container, When Fernanda woke up and saw it wasn't there, I told her I had taken it for a while for something, that I would give it back to her. I never gave it back. I told her I had accidentally broken it and paid her what it had cost. I didn't explain it to her. I wouldn't know how. The sound did not return after the mirror left the apartment. That was 18 years ago. I am a nurse. I am practical. I deal with reality every day in its most concrete and undeniable form. But I have no way to explain that mirror. Somehow I don't understand. Made its way from the back room of my grandmother's house to the antique fair of a city 300 kilometers away. I have no way to explain the sound, nor the glow, nor the figure that pointed towards it that stormy night. All I have is the rule my grandmother Clotilde gave me, which I have found works over all these years. As long as it is covered, what is inside stays inside. I don't know where that mirror is now. In some landfill, I suppose, or maybe someone picked it up before the garbage truck arrived. Maybe it's at another antique fair, with another low price, with another seller who wants to get rid of it quickly without knowing why she has that urgency. I hope that whoever has it now never removes the fabric. I hope that if they do remove it, they never look. And so ends Isabel's testimony. She wrote to me that since that university apartment, she hasn't entered any room with a covered mirror. She says it's not exactly fear, but respect. The difference between the two, according to her, is that respect doesn't paralyze you. It just reminds you that there are rules that exist for a reason, even if no one has fully explained them to you. I find it a very honest way to carry something like that. If you also have an object, a place, or a childhood experience that you never managed to fully explain, write to me. Those are the stories that resonate with me the most. Sleep well tonight, and take care of yourself. What I am about to tell you now was sent to me by a listener named Isabel. She wrote to me that she experienced this when she was 23 years old, that almost 8 years have passed since then, and that there are still nights when she wakes up with the smell in her nose. Just the smell, she told me, and that is enough for her not to be able to fall back asleep. If you also have something that haunts you like this, something that doesn't completely fade away with time, write to me. Sometimes it helps to have someone else listen. Isabel's story took place in a mountain village where she spent a summer working as a camp counselor, and it has to do with a forest that the locals knew very well, and with a very specific rule that everyone followed without questioning it: never enter the forest after dark. The job of camp monitor was not what I had planned for that summer, but when the scholarship I was hoping for didn't come through and my bank account started to speak louder than my plans, I accepted the offer without thinking too much. 3 months in a summer camp for children aged 8 to 12, in a mountain village called Fuente Oscura, with accommodation included, and a salary that wasn't generous, but was enough. I left in June with my backpack and the practical disposition of someone who has learned to adapt to what is available. Fuente Oscura was exactly the kind of village that the name suggested. Small, nestled between 2 wooded slopes, with a narrow river running through the center and a square with its church and 4 stone benches. Most of its permanent inhabitants were elderly people. The young people had left for the cities years ago, as happens in so many villages, and what remained was that specific mix of stillness and memory that places have when they have seen several generations depart. The camp was on the outskirts, in a clearing between the village and the forest. Wooden cabins, a large dining room, an activity area, a small pool. The kind of functional facility that has no aesthetic pretensions but perfectly fulfills its purpose. There were 6 monitors in total and a director named Graciela, a woman in her 40s with that quiet efficiency of someone who has organized these things many times and already has a protocol for everything. The first meeting with Graciela, before the children arrived, included a review of the camp's operating rules, schedules, safety protocols, activity organization, emergency procedures, all reasonable, all expected. And at the end, almost as a casual addition, Graciela said, "One more thing. The forest to the north of the camp. The children are not to enter there under any circumstances at any time, and the monitors are not to enter after dark." One of the other monitors, a guy named Felix, who had been at the camp for 2 summers, nodded as if he already knew. The rest of us exchanged brief glances. "Why?" I asked. Graciela looked at me with an expression that was not annoyance but something more akin to the assessment of someone measuring whether the question came from genuine curiosity or from a tendency to question the rules on principle. Because the terrain is uneven and not marked, she said, because there are uncovered water wells in some areas, and because at night it's easy to get disoriented and the village is far away. These were perfectly sensible reasons. I accepted them. But Felix, later that same afternoon, when we were alone preparing the cabins, told me something different. The reasons Graciela gave are true, he said to me, but they are not all the reasons. Felix was 26 years old and was from a town similar to Fuente Oscura, from that mountainous area, which meant he had grown up with a certain type of knowledge about the forests that city people do not have. Not theoretical knowledge, but the practical and intuitive knowledge of someone who has lived close to them since childhood and has learned to treat them with respect without needing anyone to explain exactly why. He told me, while we spread sheets over bunk beds, that the forest to the north of the camp had a reputation in the village, long before any of the current inhabitants could remember. Not a specific fame, with concrete stories and dates and names, rather a diffuse fame, the kind that accumulates in places over generations until no one knows where it started, but everyone knows it exists. The people of the village didn't use that forest. There was another forest to the south where they did walk, where they picked mushrooms in the fall, where the children played. The one to the north they left alone. Why specifically? I asked him. Felix shrugged. There are stories, he said, of people who entered at night and didn't come back or came back different. The kind of stories that have been told in villages forever and that no one knows if they are true or have been exaggerated over time. He looked at me. But those who live here don't go in, and they haven't for generations. And when someone has been respecting something for generations without questioning it, I prefer to respect that too. It was a logic that I understood, although at that moment, the skeptical part of me registered it as local superstition and filed it in the category of interesting but not necessarily significant things. That category gradually emptied throughout the summer. The first groups of children arrived, and the camp fell into that intense and noisy rhythm that is its natural state. Activities, meals, controlled excursions, the small daily crises of coexistence among children of different ages. There was no time to think too much about the northern forest, which remained there, at the back of the campgrounds, with its line of dark trees that from the clearing looked like a green wall with no apparent depth. But there was something in that forest that I noticed every time I looked at it directly. It was hard to articulate. It wasn't exactly that it looked different from normal forests. It was more a matter of silence. The other forests in the area, the southern one where we had authorized excursions, had sounds. Birds, wind among the leaves, the small noises of animal life. The northern forest from the outside, from the camp clearing, always seemed to be silent. Not the silence of a quiet place, the silence of a place where things stay still when someone looks. I mentioned it to Felix one afternoon. He nodded without surprise. Yes, he said. I noticed it too the first summer. I no longer notice it because I've gotten used to it, but it is still there. The incident that changed everything happened in mid-July, with the second shift of children already settled in. That night I was on duty. Duty meant staying awake until 1 in the morning, making a round through the cabins to ensure that all the children were in their beds and nothing required attention, and then sleeping in the counselor's cabin with the phone next to the bed in case something happened. I made the 11 o'clock round without incident. I made the 12 o'clock round also without incident. It was a quiet night, with a nearly full moon illuminating the clearing with that silvery clarity that makes nighttime places look simultaneously more and less real than during the day. I went to do the 1 o'clock round, and in cabin 7 a girl was missing. The girl's name was Sophia. She was 9 years old, and she was one of those girls who during the day were pure energy and who at night slept so deeply that her cabin mates complained that she snored. She was not the type of girl who would get up alone at night. But her bed was empty and the cabin door was ajar. I checked the bathrooms first. Empty. I checked the activity area. Nothing. I woke Felix, who was the other monitor on duty that night, and while he checked the dining room and the other facilities, I approached the edge of the esplanade, and I saw Sophia. She was standing at the edge of the camp, exactly where the illuminated ground ended and the darkness of the northern forest began. She was in a nightgown, barefoot, with her arms at her sides, looking towards the trees with a stillness that was not the stillness of a girl asleep on her feet. It was the stillness of someone who is completely attentive to something. "Sophia," I said, walking towards her quietly so as not to scare her. She did not respond. She did not move. I got closer. I reached her, put a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to me with an expression that at that moment I did not know how to classify, and that only later, thinking about it, I understood was the expression of someone who has just been interrupted in the middle of something. "What are you doing here?" I asked her in a low voice. Sophia looked at me. Her eyes were wide awake. "I was listening," she said. "Listening to what?" She pointed towards the forest. "The music," she said. I didn't hear any music. I listened for a long moment with all the attention I could muster, and all there was the silence of the northern forest and the distant sound of the river and the gentle wind among the southern trees. "There's no music, Sophia," I said. She looked at me like children do when adults say something that is obviously incorrect to them, but they don't want to be disrespectful. "There is," she said. "I've been listening to it for a while from the cabin. That's why I came out." I took her back to her cabin. She fell asleep in less than 5 minutes, as if nothing had happened. I sat on the edge of her bed for a while, looking at the closed door, thinking about what she had said. When I left, Felix was waiting for me outside. I told him what Sophia had said, the music that I hadn't heard, the way she had been standing at the edge of the forest. Felix didn't speak for a moment. "Was she looking in or out?" he asked. "In," I said, "towards the trees." Felix nodded slowly. "I'll tell Graziella something tomorrow," he said, "and let's not let the kids go near the northern edge of the property, not even during the day." The next day, Graziella listened to what we told her with the same calm, evaluative expression she had for everything. When we finished speaking, she paused for a moment in silence and then said, "Sophia was sleepwalking. It's not unusual in children her age, especially in new environments. We will note it and inform her parents so they are aware." It was a reasonable medical explanation. But then, as Felix and I were leaving, Graziella said something else. "Isabel," I turned to her, "the rules about the forest also apply to monitors outside of hours, especially at night. I understand that you were doing your job when you approached the boundary to look for the girl. But in the future, if something like this happens again, wake up another monitor before approaching alone." I looked at her. "Why?" I asked. Graciela held my gaze. "Because two people are harder to confuse than one," she said. And she didn't explain what she meant by that. That night, after the children fell asleep and the camp fell silent, I went out to the clearing with a cup of tea and sat on one of the wooden benches that faced the northern forest. I had no intention of going in. I am neither foolish nor reckless. I just wanted to sit and watch and see if I heard anything that Sophia might have called music. I was there for about 20 minutes. The forest remained in its characteristic silence, that silence that had its own texture, different from the silence of the other forests I knew. The moon was high and clear, and the line of trees was sharply defined, each trunk distinguishable, each branch. It was then that I saw them, not inside the forest, at the edge, among the first trees, just where the moonlight still reached before the darkness of the interior absorbed everything. They were small. I couldn't give an exact height, but the impression I had was of something low, about the height of a 4 or 5-year-old child, although the shape was not that of a child. It was more compact, more horizontal in a way, even though it was standing. There were several. I couldn't tell exactly how many because they moved slowly between the first trunks, from side to side, and the light was not enough to count them with certainty. 3, maybe 4. They made no noise. I remained absolutely still on the bench, with the cup of tea in my hands, not taking my eyes off that line of trees. And while I was watching them, one of them stopped and turned towards where I was. I can't describe a face because I didn't see a face. What I saw was a direction, the unmistakable feeling that something that had been moving without paying me any attention suddenly was giving me its full attention, and with that attention came something more. Not a sound, not exactly, but something that I perceived as if it were a sound, even though it didn't pass through my ears. A cadence, a rhythm, something that if I had to name it with the closest word I have, I would have called it music, even though it resembled no music I had ever heard before or since. It lasted a few seconds. Then it turned again, and I saw them move away into the forest until darkness absorbed them. I got up. I entered the dining room. I sat under the fluorescent light and stayed there until dawn. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen that night. Not Felix, not Graciela, not the other monitors. There was something about the experience that I didn't want to turn into conversation yet, as if talking about it would change something in the way I had kept it. But I observed more. In the following nights, From the window of my cabin facing north, I looked at the edge of the forest. And 2 more times, on clear moonlit nights, I saw movement among the first trees. Always late, always near the edge, never coming out into the clearing but also not completely inside. I never heard the music again. Or maybe I did hear it but learned not to pay attention to it in the same way. To treat it as Felix had described he did with silence. To get used to it without forgetting that it was there. On the last night of the last shift, when the children had left and we were finishing cleaning the facilities to close the camp until the following year, Felix and I sat on the esplanade with a bottle of cheap wine and talked about what we had experienced that summer. I told him what I had seen that night, for the first time. He listened to the end without interrupting. "What do you think they were?" I asked him when I finished. Felix took his time. "In the villages of this area," he said, "old people have different names for what lives in the forests, different explanations about where they come from and what they want." He took a sip. "But what all the names and all the explanations have in common is this. They are not from here, in the sense that they are not from the side of the world where we are. They are on the edge. And what they do on that edge, we do not do. They do it." "And the music?" I said. "The music is the way they call," he said. "Not to everyone. To some. To those who can hear it." I thought of Sophia, barefoot in her nightshirt, standing at the edge of the trees. "And what if someone enters?" I asked. "Into the forest, at night, following the music?" Felix looked at me. "I don't know for sure," he said. "But the stories told in the villages about people who entered and did not return or returned different." He fell silent for a moment. "Those who returned different took time to recognize their own family. They looked at familiar places as if they were new, as if they had been in another place for a long time, even though physically they had only spent hours. The silence that followed was long and filled with things neither of them said. I returned to the city in September. I resumed my studies, my life, my routines. The camp was left behind in the way that summer jobs are left behind, with that effect of distance that time produces on intense experiences. But Felix was right about something he told me that last night, when we were already picking up the bottle and getting ready to sleep. "What you saw," he said, "does not disappear completely. Not for those who can see it. It's like learning to distinguish a sound that was always there but that you didn't know how to listen to before. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it." He was right. Almost 8 years have passed. I live in a big city, work in an office, and lead a perfectly normal life in every verifiable sense. But there are nights, especially in summer, when the moon is high and there is enough silence, when I wake up with that smell in my nose. The smell of the northern forest, that specific mix of damp earth and resin and something older that has no precise name. And sometimes, on the edge between being asleep and being awake, I think I hear something that if I had to name it with the closest word I have, I would call music. In those moments, I get up. I turn on the light. I sit in the kitchen until dawn comes through the window. I have never returned to Fuente Oscura. But sometimes I think of Sophia, that 9-year-old girl barefoot in the dark, completely still, listening. And I wonder if she remembers that night. And if she also experiences the same thing as me in certain summers. I hope not. I hope that for her it has remained just an episode of sleepwalking, nothing more. But sometimes I don't believe that. That's all I have to share, and that's where Isabel's story ends. She wrote to me that she has never sought information about Fuente Oscura or the forests in that area, that she has consciously decided not to do so. I understand that decision. There are answers that change nothing in practice, and only add weight to something that is already heavy enough. What stayed with me the most from this story is that image of the girl at the edge of the forest, listening to something that others could not hear. If you grew up in a town with a place like that, a forest, a hill, a path that no one used without anyone fully explaining why, I would love for you to share it with me in the comments. Those collective stories are what build this space. Take care tonight. We'll hear from each other next time.